Hello, my beautiful friends. This is the last episode of the first season of Echoes of Heresy. I'm Andy, your host. This time, I will not start with a quote, but with some reflection about my personal experience. I remember traveling across Chile some years ago, winding along the windswept roads of Patagonia. Days would pass without seeing another soul, and then suddenly a village would appear. Quiet, weathered places, yet alive with history, grief, and devotion. It wasn't long before I began to notice the shrines. They were everywhere, by roadsides, tucked into hillsides, clustered at crossroads. Some were simple, others more elaborate, hand-painted, or pieced together from scrap and stone. But always the same quiet signs: candles, flags, rosaries, flowers. Many bore images I couldn't place, faces of men and women I didn't recognize, yet clearly venerated with the same reverence reserved for saints. At the center of many shrines, more widely known figures, the unmistakable image of Gauchito Gil, or the skeletal figure of San La Muerte. These were not sanctioned saints. Their images don't hang in official churches, and Rome never canonized them. But their presence was overwhelming and deeply alive. They are saints of the people, saints without canon, but not without power. Later in Santiago, I heard another name, Romualdito, a boy long dead, some say about a century ago, after a tragic confrontation with an official or with a bunch of criminals near a train station. The details are hazy, as they often are with folk saints. But his story lives on in the ritual behavior of those who come to the site of his death, seeking something beyond justice, miracles. What struck me personally was not just the belief in his power, but the structure of the devotion. Those who ask Romualdito for help, usually children or adolescents, must follow strict rules. No wish born from hate or revenge will be heard. A vow must be taken and kept. No sweets, no swearing, no games for a mouth. Something real, something difficult. And it must be spoken there, at the station, where his life ended. The more sincere the effort, the greater the chance of his intercession. There is even a way to thank him, unofficial, unwritten, but passed on among those who know. No priest teaches these rituals, no theology enforces them, and yet they persist. In these practices, spontaneous, yet rule-bound, rooted in both suffering and hope, we glimpse something ancient. A human way of making meaning, managing fear, and negotiating with the invisible forces of the world.
I'm Andy Altschuler, and this is Echoes of Heresy, a podcast about spiritual descent and divergent beliefs across time and tradition.
So what exactly is a folk saint? A folk saint is a figure, often a person who lived and died in recent memory, who is venerated by a local community or is otherwise a popular source of spiritual power. These saints are not canonized by the Catholic Church. They don't go through Vatican's formal process of beatification or sainthood, but they are treated, in practice, like saints. People pray to them, make offerings, build shrines, and tell stories of miracles attributed to them. Some are martyrs, others are healers, outlaws, or even criminals, redeemed by suffering or by their closeness to the marginalized. Some aren't clearly historical at all, more allegorical images, but have become sanctified through repetition, art, and ritual. What unites them isn't dogma, it's pure devotion. Folk saints are born at the crossroads of need and memory. They emerge when official religion is too distant, too abstract, or too aligned with power to speak to everyday suffering. Folk saint veneration is far from being a uniquely Latin American phenomenon. I've seen similar devotional landscapes elsewhere. Trees in Central Asia planted by Sufi healers centuries ago, thick with ribbons, prayers, and belief in their healing power. Mountain springs in the North Caucasus, where Ossetian folklore figures are invoked alongside New Testament and Byzantine saints. These hybrid devotions show how sacred meaning gathers around places, objects, and memories. Yet in Latin America, this dynamic feels especially vivid, more public, more embodied, and woven deeply into everyday life. Rooted in a long history of Catholic tradition, Indigenous cosmology, Afro-Caribbean spiritual practices, and mestizo cultural memory, the popular religiosity of the region creates fertile ground for unofficial saints. In fact, the Church often finds itself playing catch-up, cautiously acknowledging some folk cults while condemning others as superstition or even heresy. Sociologist Roberto da Mata once remarked that Brazilian folk religion saves Catholicism from the Church. That is, it keeps the sacred close to the people. The same could be said of much of Latin America. Key traits of folk saints often include a tragic or unjust death, especially involving violence, poverty, or state abuse, a connection to a specific place, a roadside, a grave, a bridge, or train station, turning ordinary geography into sacred ground, a miraculous reputation built on personal stories, rumors, fulfilled promises, a cult maintained from below by lay people, not clergy, and finally, a system of reciprocity. You ask, you promise, you thank. The saint helps, but expects something in return. In a sense, these figures reveal something essential about religious life, not just in Latin America, but everywhere. That beyond doctrines and institutions, there is a human drive to seek spiritual power in the places where life is most fragile. Let's meet some of the most well-known and beloved folk saints across Latin America, starting with the red-scarfed Robin Hood of Argentina, Gauchito Gil. Along Argentina's highways, especially in the northern provinces like Corrientes and Chaco, you'll see flashes of red fluttering in the wind, ribbons, flags, bandanas, marking shrines dedicated to this folk saint. This had been a tradition of more than 100 years in this region, though in late 20th century the tradition of Gil's veneration expanded across the Spanish-speaking countries, including even Spain, with some cautious attempts by local parishes to integrate his cult in semi-official Catholic frameworks. His real name may have been Antonio Mamerto Gil Núñez. A 19th century gaucho, he was a deserter from the army, possibly fighting on the losing side of a civil war. He became an outlaw, but one who reportedly gave to the poor, healed the sick, and avoided unnecessary violence. Yet story goes that before his execution by police, Gil warned his executioner, "Your son is gravely ill. If you kill me, he will die. If you pray to me instead, he will live." The executioner ignored him, but when he returned home, he found his son on death's door. Remembering Gil's words, he prayed, and the boy recovered. That was the beginning of the cult. Now, every 8th of January, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims gather at his sanctuary in Mercedes, Corrientes. They bring offerings, red wine, cigarettes, car parts, football jerseys. The shrines are often covered in red, his signature color. Gauchito Gil has become a symbol of popular justice, a saint who defends the poor, the traveler, the abandoned. He was never canonized, but his devotees say he is more responsive than any official saint, and sometimes more forgiving. Then there is Jesús Malverde, up north in Mexico. Supposedly executed in 1909, Malverde was a kind of Mexican Robin Hood-like figure, stealing from the rich, giving to the poor, defying corrupt officials. No photograph of him exists, but there is a recognizable and semi-canonical image of him. Some say he never lived at all, but his devotees treat him as a real protector, especially for migrants, workers, and those entangled with the law. In recent decades, Malverde's cult spread among narco-traffickers who pray for safe passage and survival. This has led to his media image as a narco-saint, so to say. But this flattens his meaning. To many poor Mexicans, Malverde is firstly a folk hero, a man who defied power and sided with the people when no one else would. His main shrine in Culiacan, at the heart of Mexico's Sinaloa state, is filled with thank you plaques, photos, crutches, even bundles of cash. Pilgrims pray to him for work, for justice, for lost relatives. His image now appears on t-shirts, decals. He is mentioned in folk songs and rap lyrics. Also, in northern Mexico, in the dusty town of Espinazo, Nuevo León, people still gather around the memory of another type of a saint, José de Jesús Fidencio Constantino Cintora, known simply as El Niño Fidencio. Born in the late 1800s, Fidencio was a folk healer, a curandero, who treated thousands using herbs, mud baths, and spiritual diagnosis. Though an adult, he had a childlike voice and demeanor, earning him the name El Niño, meaning the boy. He never married, never had family, never charged money, and never sought fame. Fidencio's miracles, whether real, imagined, or exaggerated, drew massive crowds. People brought the blind, the lame, the dying. He treated them all. When he died in 1938, a folk church grew in his name, known today as the Fidencista movement. To this day, Espinosa hosts annual pilgrimages. Followers say that El Niño continues to heal through mediums, rituals, and dreams. He represents a gentle, alternative spirituality deeply rooted in Mexican traditions of healing and mysticism. But not all folk saints were once human. Some were born from something deeper, maybe older. Let's talk about San La Muerte, perhaps the most visually striking of the folk saints. A skeletal figure carved in bone, metal, or even bullets. Sometimes dressed in robes, sometimes bare. His cult is strongest in Paraguay and northeastern Argentina, particularly among the Guarani-speaking communities. He is often confused with Santa Muerte of Mexico, but the two are different. San La Muerte is a male figure, so to speak. He is more secretive and more tied to local traditions, though his cult is becoming more widespread across South America. Devotees turn to him for protection, especially from violence, prison, or betrayal. He is feared and respected, but rarely loved. Offerings include tobacco, liquor, and blood. Sometimes he is kept hidden on the person, close to the skin like a personal amulet or tattooed. San La Muerte isn't just personification of death, he is controlled death. People say, I don't worship death, I make a pact with it. This saint doesn't demand piety, he demands respect. You must keep your promises or suffer consequences. And then there is his better known and more flamboyant counterpart, Santa Muerte, Holy Death from Mexico. Clearly female representation of death. She's everywhere, on candles, murals, street altars, dressed in flowing robes and carrying a scythe. She looks like a Virgin of Guadalupe crossed with the Grim Reaper. Her following has exploded over the last 2 decades, especially among the poor, the marginalized, the forgotten. LGBTQ plus youth, sex workers, street vendors, migrants, people for whom traditional saints might seem too far, too clean, too righteous. She is also a patron saint, so to say, of those operating in high-risk professions. In many ways, Santa Muerte fills the void left by institutions, religious or political, that have failed them. The colors of her robes signal the type of petition: white for purification, red for love, black for protection or vengeance, gold for wealth, purple for health and healing. Despite her association with the narco underworld, many devotees stress that Santa Muerte is morally neutral. She listens to sincere petitions, regardless of the supplicant's social standing or sinfulness. Both Santa Muerte and San La Muerte embody a complex fusion of traditions, blending indigenous gods of the underworld and liminal spaces with Catholic imagery of death, reminding us of our own mortality and the inevitability of divine judgment. And they are not alone. In Guatemala, there is Rey Pascual, the Death King. In New Mexico, Doña Sebastiana, who rides her cart through the night, choosing who will die next. Across the region, dozens of death-like figures linger, straddling the line between saint and spectre, protector and punisher. Of course, this isn't an exhaustive list, not of the human saints, nor the skeletal ones. Across Latin America, there are dozens, maybe hundreds of local figures, some known only in one town, one barrio, one roadside shrine. Each has their own story, their own rituals, their own relationship with the people who turn to them. In future episodes, we might take a closer look at individual folk saints, tracing how their cults evolved, what social forces shaped their veneration, and why certain figures endure across generations. When the church looks at folk saints, it sees a mirror, and sometimes it flinches, not because these figures deny faith, but because they reflect faith as it lives beyond control. The official position of the Catholic Church on most folk saints is cautious at best, disapproving at most. In many cases, especially with figures like Santa Muerte, the response has been harsh. Mexican bishops have publicly condemned her veneration as satanic. Altars have been destroyed, devotees denounced. But the reality on the ground is more complicated. In many Latin American countries, the church influence remains strong, but not absolute. And when institutions falter, whether political, economic, or spiritual, people improvise. They turn to who listens, to who answers. Folk saints often emerge in spaces where institutional religion seems distant. Borderlands, rural villages, prisons, inner cities. They fill gaps the church can't or won't reach in the messy realities of everyday life: danger, addiction, poverty, migration, loss. And while official saints offer models of virtue, folk saints often offer something else: proximity. They were once sinners. They know suffering. They're not up on the altar. They're at your side. Still, the line between folk devotion and church orthodoxy is not always a battleground. In fact, more often than not, it's a negotiation. In rural parishes, it's not uncommon to see candles to Gauchito Gil burning next to a statue of the Virgin Mary. In some towns, processions include both official saints and unofficial ones, side by side. Some priests, especially in areas where folk saints are deeply embedded, quietly tolerate or even accommodate these practices, seeing them as expressions of the lived faith rather than heresy. This uneasy coexistence has deep roots. Latin American Catholicism has always been shaped by syncretism, a blending of traditions that goes back to colonization, indigenous beliefs, African spiritualities, and some localized European Catholic rituals which found their ways in their devotees' new homes. These practices have mixed and remixed for centuries. The result is a spiritual ecosystem where the sacred wears many masks, and where the boundaries between official and popular religion are porous and shifting. To some, that's dangerous. To others, it's precisely what keeps faith real. Folk saints are born from this tension, and from the freedom it allows. They are not catechized, they are not canonized, but they are deeply, defiantly believed in. Let's return to where we began, a boy named Romualdito. His veneration isn't massive like Gauchito Gil's, for instance, or publicized like the one of Santa Muerte. There are no national pilgrimages, no media coverage, but what exists is quietly extraordinary. His cult is small, local, intimate, and driven mostly by minors, but certainly not exclusively so. Many locals carry their devotion deep inside throughout their lifetime. They come to the place where he died, a train station, that symbolic edge between places, and they ask him for help, not just for themselves, but for others, a sick parent, a worried friend, protection on a dangerous night. There is no consensus about who Romualdito was. Some researchers claim that he was not even a child, but a man in his 40s, who was unfortunate enough to die a violent death. Regardless of the background story, he represents a powerful archetype of unjust death of an innocent person. While Romualdito's story is rooted in a specific Chilean urban legend, what's most compelling isn't the exact biographical detail, but the shape and character of his veneration. His cult offers a rare case study of a child-centered devotional system that is at once spontaneous and highly structured. As I said earlier, this is not a tradition imposed by clergy or enforced by institutions. It is driven by kids and teens, passed quietly among peers, yet it's surprisingly ritualized. There are expectations, taboos, moral requirements, and a distinct pattern of vow-making and reciprocal exchange. Even without an authority figure or printed manual, the framework is coherent. It teaches that if you want divine help, you must offer something in return. And more than that, your motives must be pure. Requests rooted in anger or jealousy are disqualified. In other words, spiritual engagement is contingent on moral clarity. The act of vow-making becomes central. These are often small, tangible sacrifices, a month without sweets, a promise to stop swearing, or an effort to mend behavior. These pledges echo what anthropologists would call a sacrificial economy of reciprocity, a structure deeply embedded in both indigenous cosmologies and global religious practices. One does not simply ask the sacred for a favor. One enters a relationship framed by rules and bound by responsibility. The setting of Romualdito's cult is equally significant. The site of his death, a train station, functions symbolically as a liminal space, a threshold between worlds. Transit zones like these often attract sacred attention in folklore, like gates, crossroads, bridges, and so on. They are neither here nor there, and so they symbolically and mythopoetically become sites of possibility, transformation, and vulnerability. In this way, the location mirrors the spiritual function, a place between innocence and responsibility, childhood and agency, the visible and the invisible. From a scholarly standpoint, Romualdito's cult invites reflection on how religion operates outside official frameworks, how it evolves organically within communities, even among children, and how it encodes moral and spiritual systems without even appearing on paper. It also points to something broader, a universal instinct to sacralize loss, to bargain with mystery, and to ritualize hope. If this episode has stirred your interest in the strange and compelling world of Latin American folk saints, you're not alone. Scholars from anthropology, religious studies, sociology, and history have been working for decades to understand what these devotions mean, culturally, spiritually, and politically. In my humble opinion, a landmark starting point is Frank Graziano's Cultures of Devotion, Folk Saints of Spanish America, published in 2007. Graziano gives us not only portraits of the saints themselves, but also detailed descriptions of shrines, rituals, and the lived religious experiences of devotees. It's ethnography with heart and clarity. For those interested in the theological and anthropological dimensions of death-related cults, R. Andrew Chestnut is essential. His book, Devoted to Death, Santa Muerte, the Skeletal Saint, published in 2012, is probably the most cited academic work on Santa Muerte. You can also explore journal articles in Latin American Research Review, Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Anthropology, or Nova Religio, many of which cover regional case studies and theoretical frameworks for understanding unofficial religious movements. Lastly, don't underestimate the power of local voices, devotional pamphlets, shrine graffiti, online testimonies. They offer raw, living insight into these cults. Academic writing can help us see the patterns, but the pulse of the saints lives in the streets, the candles, and the whispered promises. It was just a glimpse into the world of saints without canon, but not without power. If it has resonated with you, stay with us. There is much more ahead of Echoes of Heresy. In future episodes, we'll be exploring the many faces of spiritual divergence: Gnostic visions, antinomian ethics, crypto-pagan rituals, contested theologies, suppressed movements, outlaw mystics, hybrid identities, and heretical thinkers whose ideas still unsettle the faithful. If you have questions, reflections, or heresies of your own, I'd love to hear from you. You can reach out, share your thoughts, or support the show by subscribing, leaving a review, or simply spreading the word. The podcast series is still very much in experimental mode. There is still a lot to think about in regards to format, presentation, or scope, and any feedback will help me improve or tailor the content based on the interest. Whether you like simpler and briefer episodes, or a deep dive into certain ideas, or a combination of approaches, any advice is valuable. This episode also marks the end of our first season, a journey across the wide landscape of beliefs that refuse easy categories, from antiquity to the present day. The next season will take a different shape. Several episodes, all woven together under a single thematic arc. The concept of eternal feminine in Western spirituality, its central but theologically risky nature. More details to come in due course. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep listening for the heresies that echo through time.